Okay, it says we are live. It says we are live. So, welcome everyone. Let me put us in gallery view. Welcome to America's Voices, episode 17. We took a few weeks off because it's summer now. We have a fantastic show for you. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, my name is Daniela Bloom. I'm considered now America's Relationship Authority, and I have pivoted my interest in going underneath. That's right. You've heard it here first. I went from LA's to America's Relationship Authority. I've pivoted my interest towards human story underneath the headlines. It is time for some grassroots conversation because our polarization, our echo chambers in our country are just getting louder. Many of us are living in parallel realities depending on what news sources we go to. We're following different pain points. We have different concerns, and it's a shame because we are stronger together. So it's the conversation. One of the biggest subjects near and dear to my heart, and it hits very close to home, as I'm in Los Angeles dealing with this firsthand, as we are seeing anti-Israel motions trying to be passed in Los Angeles County school system, the second largest school system in the country. So when you mess with my kids and you mess with Israel, all bets are off. It's become a priority. So that is what's inspired this show today, because as a Jewish community, we do need to stand together and be united on this. However, it seems that with many liberals and Jewish liberals, Israel is 90th. Israel is 90th on my list of priorities. Their attention is elsewhere. They have also seen Israel through the lens of BLM, which is an extremely Marxist organization, which is, defines the oppressed and oppressor. And considering that America and Israel are the most support gay rights, women's rights, there's Arab legislation, Arab representation in the parliament. Is how do the liberal progressives get it so wrong when it comes to Israel? We have a very special guest this evening, Laureen Lipsky. She is an outspoken activist, and she has a lot to say on the subject, including what her own wake-up moment was. So we're going to go around, briefly introduce ourselves, and then give the floor to Laureen and start this honest, candid discussion. If you are joining us live on Facebook, please share your comments. We'd love to incorporate them. We are so glad you're here, and we are stronger together. Okay, so with that said, Mr. Joel Patrick, welcome to our show.
How you doing, America? I'm here. My name is Joel Patrick, and I feel like I'm here mostly as a listener today, but I'm sure at some point I will jump in. As far as my political affiliation, more as time goes on and we get away from the last administration, I feel like I don't really have a political affiliation. Although I'm definitely leaning more to the conservative side. I won't even say Republican. I would just say more conservative, libertarian. Yeah, that's pretty much me.
Fantastic. We are so glad to have you here. Mr. Architect is back from San Francisco.
Hello.
Say hello.
Hello.
Yes.
So I called the architect because I'm trying to build something in another project. Let's see. So I was born under socialism, raised liberal Democrat, went to law school, learned to see all sides, and here I am. What can I say?
We're so glad you're here and that you brought your skill set with us tonight. Okay, Mr. Mark from Vegas.
From Las Vegas. Yes, we are here. It's about 108 today. Just a breezy, balmy day.
Right.
Mark Lipp, pretty much always been a Republican and social libertarian, I guess is a combination. My technical title is Reverend Dr. Mark Lipp, but I usually go as OG because I'm the old guy of this group. I am married to an Israeli kibbutz in Israel. So all this and getting married in November. So we'll all be in Israel if we can get in. And so this is all very near and dear to my heart.
So glad to have you here. We love your perspective.
You.
And Mr. Newton Rhodes has snuck in the call. Can you introduce yourself, sir?
Good evening. I just want to correct Mark. I'm not sure he's the old guy in the group. It might be close. I'm not sure.
Pretty close.
I see we have a full house.
Yes.
My name is Leon Rhodes. I'm running for president as a Democratic candidate. But I'm a conservative, so there's a little star by my name. I just want to welcome everybody to the evening.
Oh, we're so glad to have you.
How you
So
doing?
both Lorraine and Lee are representing New York. So the floor and introduce yourself, and let's get this started.
Hi, my name is Laureen Lipsky. I am the co-founder along with Deborah Peretz, and I'm the CEO also of Taking Back the Narrative. So our aim with the initiative, it's a Zionist education initiative to fill in the blanks of historical facts about Israel. So many organizations focus on biblical connection Jews have to Israel. Then they focus, and then they jump to 1948. Well, what was in between, right? Jews have a continual presence in Israel. We pushed back against occupiers. We liberated our land. So we really hope to focus in on those historical touch points in order to prove our right historically and legally to the land of Israel. So that's what I'm doing. I'm also an op-ed writer. I write about anti-Semitism. I write about Israel. I write about politics. And I'm also a political strategist. I've worked on several campaigns, and I advise current candidates who are running.
Amazing, amazing. So this is near and dear to your heart. It's literally become your career.
Yes.
Your
yes.
career. So you have had a chance to speak to probably a diversity of crowds, right?
Absolutely. And it actually started with my own.
And you were probably called. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah. So to answer about the political angle, so I am a first generation American. My parents escaped communist Russia, communist USSR. They came in 79. I was born in 82. And so just inherently because of that, I grew up in a Republican home. But it was more of the Bush Republicans, right? The Rhino Republicans, which was the dominant strain of the party for a long time. And so for me, I didn't really take politics seriously, right? Like for me, I voted for Democrats before. I hope no one hates me too much for admitting this. I voted for Cuomo at one point. I voted for Schumer, votes I absolutely regret. But for me, I always voted for the person and never for the party. And it wasn't until Trump came along, although I was a never Trumper right before he was gearing up against Hillary. I was actually like a Rubio girl, but then he was not running anymore. But then I saw that the Patriot movement is what, to me, was the right course for America. So it was actually President Trump who really lit the fire under my Republican, journey.
Amazing. I think many of us can relate to that, and I appreciate that. So getting into this, I've had, I don't know if and if you guys have been on Clubhouse, or I know you're on different social medias, but I would like to ask you all, I have a lot of liberal friends, and some of them are open-minded and they still consider themselves Zionists, but a lot of disconnected.
You froze for a second.
Uh-oh.
All right.
All right.
Well,
So
while
Lorraine.
while Daniela she's going to come back. The show must continue.
Lorraine,
So,
what? Okay, she's back.
Okay, I'm back. See,
Okay.
And so I'm glad Mark is the co-host. If that happens again, Mark, you're just going to take over. Yes. So I wanted to hear from you guys with the experiences you've had with bringing Israel up to liberals and to liberal Jews, and what your takeaways were. I had a very candid conversation with a Jewish liberal yesterday who basically said, global warming is number one. The world is ending in 9 years, so that takes precedent for him. And then voter integrity, equality rights, and then Israel. And he doesn't really want to involve himself in Israel because he felt that ever since we're being was assassinated, that there was no more left movement, and so there was no leadership that he could align himself with. I invited him, I begged him to come on this call because he said, I don't want to be involved in this call because people could die because of my lack of misinformation. And I said to him, well, being unaware of information is just detrimental, if not more so. It was just an incredibly confusing response for me to hear, considering all the other issues, like, that are also ending in dire circumstances, misinformation about BLM, for example. So, it's we don't want to turn off people to Israel. We want to invite them in, and we want them to start to care. And it's frustrating. It's very frustrating, brainer to many of us on the call, why Israel is an ally, the exact democratic values it represents, the fact that most people don't realize how tiny this country is. It fits into the size of New Jersey and surrounded by 56 Arab countries that most Jews are not even allowed to set foot in. Frustrating, it's frustrating. So if someone else wants to share what their experiences have been like in terms of broaching the subject of Israel, and where do we go?
So my experience has been frustrating, to say the least. I, like most of you, most of my friends were liberal growing up. I moved to New York in 2004. I, associated mostly, everyone here is pretty much liberal. I was friends with mostly non-Jews. And I had my, as Danielle said, my aha moment in 2014. I was watching CNN, reading the New York Times. And this was actually shortly after, probably a year prior, 2013, I went to hear Natan Sharansky speak, the Zionist hero. I heard his name growing up. And after he was done speaking, I raised my hand so high. And the only thing I wanted to ask him was, why is Israel building more settlements? We now know that those are Jewish communities. They're perfectly legal to be there. And the only reason I didn't ask the question because another uninformed Jew, as I call many of our friends on the left who are Jewish, asked the question, right? So that was my mindset. So then I had my aha moment in 2014. I was watching CNN. It was during the previous Hamas war, and they were giving airtime to Hamas militants, and they were not giving any equal time to Israeli officials. And so at the time, I had 2 Israeli friends, only online, and I saw what they were posting on Facebook was so different than what I was seeing on CNN. And so I started, whatever I was learning, I started to share. And during that process, I lost 90% of my liberal friends. Jews, non-Jews, but especially Jews, I have to say, especially Jews. They were not into a Jewish voice bringing truth to the topic of Israel.
And why do you think that is? Because they were your friends. So why do you think that they didn't want to have the misinformation corrected?
I think a lot of it, if we look at historical events, right? So after the Holocaust, there's a famous saying that Jews had a very short few years of sympathy from the world, right? So we go from 1945, the world feels, for the most part, most of the world feels bad for Jews as a whole. We just went through an atrocious genocide. We have a struggling, state in the making. And then 1967 happens. Israel does the impossible. It beats all the Arab armies that were trying to conquer Israel, trying to wipe Jews, off the map. Suddenly, Jews go from being the victims to being the victors. And in academia,
but you meant 1948. I just want to make sure you meant 1948.
1967, right?
67.
Because 48, we were still having sympathy. So it took until 1967. And in 1967,
I see what you're saying.
Yeah, yeah. And in 1967, academia was aligning itself with the so-called Palestinians, who are actually Palestinian Arabs, right? Because Palestine was is a region. We have Israel, we have Jordan. So just as there were Palestinian Jews, there were Palestinian Arabs. And we can break down even further later in the conversation. And so academia has always been left, right? So in the background, and there's no other word to call it, but anti-Semitism, this anti-Semitism was seeping into our universities, into our academic journals, but it was more in the background, right? And then fast forward to Obama. Obama made Israel political with his Iran deal, turning his back on Israel. And so all of a sudden you have a lot of liberal Jews who grew up not really caring about Israel. Israel was just over there, right? Like not understanding that for Jews, Israel's our homeland, right? Like all people come from places, right? Like you talk to a French person, you ask what's their homeland, France, right? A Brazilian person, what's their homeland, Brazil, right? Our nationality is American, but our ethnicity is from elsewhere for the most part. And they don't see Israel as our homeland. And I've heard this from many, many liberals who I questioned. They said, oh, well, Judaism is just my religion, right? It's something that I practice on the high holidays. Not understanding that it's not just a religion. We're an ethno-religious tribe. Judaism is a religion that Jews happen to practice. So there's this whole disconnect, right? So it's something that was over there. And that's something I understand because when I was growing up, it was also over there. I didn't understand that very deep ancestral connections. We have so many negatives at play, right? We have the media, we have the fact that suddenly Jews are not victims, right? Like, I mean, Israel is the 8th most powerful country in the world. And it's that intersectionality that really started in the 2000s, in the early 2000s, culminated with Obama, and here we are today.
And what I also hear from them is, I don't know enough to comment, so I just want to cut it off. But yet they will listen for hours on the Palestinian monologues of oppression and feeling like refugees on Clubhouse and NPR. Interesting to me as the Jewish that we. I said to this liberal, I said, it's like, if you bring this down to a psychotherapist perspective, it's like you're giving charity to every single person and organization, but your own. And I'm sure your own family has been through the Holocaust or was kicked out of some country in the Middle East. How does this not have a more powerful connection for you? And it really is a disconnect. And the other thing I heard this week, let me know what you think. And Joel, I'd love you to weigh in on this too. Say what you want about, the people who support BLM, the Blacks who are feeling that they are, wronged and require reparations, and the Palestinians who, are saying that they want to free Palestine. We know it's not about the land. They do have a sense of loyalty, even though they can kill each other, right? They still have a sense of loyalty to stand up against Jewish people. We have no loyalty to each other sometimes, especially now. It's the Jews, the liberal Jews all the way to the left and also all the way to the right that make it so hard to unite and stand together on Israel. Because when someone from the Jewish faith speaks against Israel, it's felt 10 times louder.
Absolutely. I have an anecdote about that. So I knew this woman years ago. She was a Indian Christian woman. So most Indian Christians are actually pro-Israel. India feels an affinity for the most part with the Jewish homeland through terrorism, through occupation, the British occupation. And so I saw on Facebook that she was giving charity to a Hamas affiliated group. And to me, I thought it was just an honest mistake. I reached out to her and I said, hey, just so you know that this is affiliated with Hamas, just so you know, I hope you let others know, et cetera. And she says to me, no, I know, and I'm proud to support Hamas. And I did a double take and I was just thinking, wait, like there's a disconnect here. Like, I don't understand. You're Indian, you're Christian, and you support a murderous organization. And she tells me that 2 of her best friends who are Jewish told her all the ills that Israel commits against the Palestinians. And that is why she finds it in her heart so important to support any Hamas-related charity. She wouldn't have supported that charity had it not been for her two Jewish friends. And like you said, Daniela, gives legitimacy. And that is why every time that a Jewish liberal is misinformed, and I'm not going to even just, point out the liberals, it's also non-liberals who don't know the facts. So that's what we're trying to do with Taking Back the Narrative. We're trying to educate all people, Jews, non-Jews, to know the historical facts, right? So once you know the facts, it's hard to refute it. So people who say, Palestinians, people who say Israel was created in 1948, people who say Israel was born in 48 because of the Holocaust, all of that's not true. And so it lends to a false narrative that Jews just plopped from Europe, where we're not even from, right? Where we had, hundreds and thousands of years of persecution. Same thing with Jews from Arab lands, and they're forgotten, right? No one talks about the Mizrahim. No one talks about Sephardic Jews, right? So the false narratives that Jews plopped from Europe, ended up in Israel, stole the land. And if those Jews don't know how to push back.
This is, I don't mean to interrupt, but this is very important, that what you're saying, right? Because there's a disconnect between 70 AD when the Romans conquered Jerusalem to 1948, right? It kind of assumes that during that entire period of time that Jews did not exist in Israel, and that somehow they just ended up there in 1948 out of sympathy after World War II. And you mentioned this earlier in the call, and I wanted to say something about it then. So I hope maybe you could enlighten us a little bit more about this, because I want to understand this, because this will help me in speaking with the people. Because see, on the right, you've got people that have a problem with Jews too. And it's mostly people that are into conspiracy theories, people that believe that the Jews there are imposters, that they're not the real Jews, right? And this is something that I want to be able to speak a little bit more articulately about this topic, because Jews didn't just end up there in 1948. We can't just assume that between 70 AD and 1948 that there were no Jews in the land. That doesn't make sense.
Absolutely. Jews had a continual presence, right? So the Jews with the Muslims, actually was mostly Jews, pushed back against the Crusaders in the 1100s. Jews were there, there was a famous story about a town called Peki'in in northern Israel. So when the Romans, obviously destroyed the second temple and, took a lot of Jews as slaves to Italy, also expelled, a lot of other Jews, there still were Jews who remained. Like, the Romans did not kill every single Jew. Plus, as an empire, they need people to pay taxes, right? Like, you need to get taxes from somewhere, so you can't kill all your subjects. And a lot of the priestly class ended up as farmers, hiding out for 2,000 years in a small village, which is now a Druze village, called Peki'in in northern Israel. And the Jews were there until 1938, when they were driven out by Muslim anti-Semitism. We need to talk about those stories. We need to talk about how there, in Jerusalem, for example, there was a Turkish survey in 1875 that admitted that Jews were the majority in that city at that time, right? How come the 1800s are not talked about? How come the 1700s are not talked about? All the different aliyahs, there were Jews, returning to Israel from North Africa, from the Caucasus Mountains, from Yemen, right? There's controversy right now about Silwan, a neighborhood in Jerusalem, about land rights. The Yemenites were there in the 1800s. The false claim that Sheikh Jarrah was conquered by Jews, the opposite, right? It was actually the Jordanians who resettled a lot of their people in that area, and Jews had the land rights, Jews had the land deeds. For thousands of years, Jews have been praying to Jerusalem. No other people do that. And, I wrote an article called, If My Great Uncle Was a Palestinian Jew, Who Are You, Rashida Tlaib? And in the article, I write, why would we choose such an oddly shaped resource poor land if Jews didn't have a connection, right? I mean, why not choose somewhere abundantly resourceful, like, I don't know, Brazil, to go to hope to? No, because in our veins, in our ancestral pull, and in historical, the rights of our historical presence, our ancestors, it's in Jerusalem. Like we have all the evidence through archaeology, through art. In Gaza, even there's a famous synagogue from the 6th century. Like it's all there. It's all in the land of Israel.
I think, though, that the problem
And also,
much
go
deeper.
ahead, Mark.
And what I mean by that is American Jews, and I'll speak in that group, have a disconnect to Israel from the time they're born. Organized religion is on the decline in the United States. Judaism, Christianity, all organized religions. When you ask somebody who's a Jew, forgetting they're Republican or Democrat, they have little connection. And one of the great programs that helped that is Birthright, where they were sending all the Jewish kids to Israel to learn more about it and get a connection. American Jews don't have a connection to Israel for the most part.
Absolutely.
You can have all the talking points you want. You can sit there and say 1948, 1967, look at all the rockets, 4,000 or 5,000 rockets that hit Israel. It's still a faraway place, and the American Jews, for the most part, don't have the connection.
100% agree. And it really takes that aha moment. Like I said, I didn't have a connection, right? Even though I grew up, my parents gave money to the American Friends of Magen David Adom. They gave money to the Israel Cancer Research Fund. My own paternal grandmother lived in Netanya for 13 years. But first of all, I didn't even know that I was Jewish until I was 7 years old. I remember how I found out that I was Jewish. I'm going to date myself here, but Lassie was on TV. And the main character was a little boy, a white Christian boy. He got on his knees before bed. He crossed himself, prayed to Jesus, and went off to a peaceful sleep. So I thought that that's what all children do before they go to bed. And so for months, I would cross myself before bed, get on my knees and pray. I mean, I didn't really understand who Jesus was, but that was my routine. And one night, my father walks by my room and he looks at me and he said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Oh, I'm just praying before bed." And he says to me, we're Jewish. I had no idea. We would celebrate holidays, but they were never discussed what the holidays were about. It was just relatives coming over to eat like a fancy meal. And I remember, and I was young, I was 7, 8 years old. And I remember being just obsessed with, oh my gosh, now I want to find out more about who we are. And I celebrated observed my bat mitzvah on top of Masada when I was 13 years old. And I remember being there, and the rabbi who we had hired, because my parents did not send me to Hebrew school, even though I begged. And the reason was political, because the rabbi was very liberal. And my father said, "We did not escape from a communist country for you to be indoctrinated by a liberal rabbi." So I never had a religious education. And so our rabbi was talking about Anne Frank, whom I just had learned about in school. But I was more interested about the story of the Judean warriors, right, who defended the last of the land, right, before succumbing to the Romans. So slowly that built in, but that still wasn't enough. I still did not, like you said, did not have that connection to Israel until I realized how much the media is lying and contributing to anti-Semitism. So I'm seeing right now, so Daniela, to your point, I'm actually seeing now some liberal Jews who are waking up after the horrific rise of anti-Semitism, even here in New York. There was basically a Hamas rally outside of my apartment. Hamas flags flying, and the Democrats here are not stopping them, not doing anything. But so I think some Jews are getting scared, and through that process, they at least are open to finding out more. So it depends how deep their ideology is to the left. Like if you're a hardcore BLM supporter, if you're a hardcore, the most appropriate term is Obamaist, right? Then, and you're upset that Bibi gave that speech, and rebuked Obama, and you still hold that grudge, then you're not going to be open to listening. But if you're seeing the rise of hate because Israel is defending itself against terrorism. For those Jews, I think there's some kind of opening.
Yeah, I would agree. I actually asked that liberal because I was former liberal, so I get what is important to them, and so I would say, well, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
We're still good. Okay, good. I would say, okay, if you go to any Israeli rally today, this is what you'll find. You'll find Israeli flags, American flags. You'll find singing. You'll find, talk of peace. You won't hear any vilifying the other unless it's I lost my train of thought because I just added someone wonderful into the group. But I said, if you go to a Free Palestine rally, you're not going to hear any talk of, let's coexist with our Jewish brothers and sisters. We want peace. We want, hi, Mary, coexistence. You just hear from the river to the sea, Palestine shall be free. And so I will ask them, does that sound like, wanting to reach a two-state solution and living in coexistence and harmony? And there's quite a bit of anger at these rallies and at these protests, and there's not one American flag. So just by helping them observe the different, just the experiential difference is noteworthy for them.
Daniela, I think you definitely hit it on the mark. So again, in my family, I have liberals, so I speak from experience. And again, I'm not painting every liberal as being embarrassed to be an American, but I definitely know that there are a lot of liberals, especially these days, as the Democrats are moving to the left in its entirety, that having pride for America, I think, is very much tied to being pro-Israel. So the more some of these liberals, in unfortunately growing numbers, are embarrassed to be American, are not proud of the American flag, some of them outright hate America, the more the distance from the only Democrat country in the Middle East.
You mean democratic?
Democratic, yeah. Exactly, right. But that's something to explore, right? And so there's a reason why a lot of Republicans are pro-Israel. And I really want to push back on, at least in my experience, I have not come across any Christian that is trying to convert me or who pins their support of Israel on possible Jewish conversion, right? And I think that that's the false talking point that liberal Jews spread. It's like, oh, well, Christians only support Israel because they just want us to all convert. Well, that's not true. Like, I mean,
that's not true at all. There's no truth to that.
Right. I mean, I'm sure there's some, but
it's more than that. Yeah. It's not that it's not true. They're not religious at all, the leftist Jews. They don't give a damn about our religion, yet they keep accusing the Christians of trying to convert us. And we just had, Daniela was there, we just had 2 events with Christians, and they call us our big brothers and sisters. They're not trying to convert us. They're not trying to get us to accept Jesus Christ. But I'd like to go back to what you were talking about, your education as far as being Jewish, when Daniela allows me to speak.
Yeah, okay, she has an opinion. Miri, you just want to say a quick hello to the group and introduce yourself?
Hi, Miri Rabinovich.
Yes, Miri is from Los Angeles. Miri and I race theory and supporting Israel and its rights to exist. And we appreciate her here. She has a lot to say, especially with what she's seen her own children go through and have it so wrong. It's tough when it's in your own family. So
my kids were raised exactly the opposite. And I can't remember the name of the young woman that just spoke. They knew they were Jewish.
Laureen.
They were sent, Gloria?
Laureen.
They knew they were Jewish. We celebrated the holidays. We went to temple. The left is so cancerous that they took over even birthrights, because there are some young people who go to birthrights in Israel and then they stand there and proselytize against Israel because they were brainwashed and sent in order to do that on purpose. I also know that Kufi, who's Christians United for Israel, who've been wonderful supporters of Israel are losing a lot of the young generations because they're being stolen by the left.
I agree 100%. My sister went on Birthright, and she comes back and says how Judea and Samaria belongs to the Palestinians. I was outraged. We were hoping that she would go on Birthright and learn actual history. So there is that ideological component.
My kids went to Israel on an exchange program. They studied the history in Israel by visiting the sites from the Bible. They visited every place. They were there for a half a year. They saw the truth. And yet when they went to college, or one of them joined the tech world, we're done. That's it. We lost them. And one of them, who is a conservative and is a Republican, is married to a leftist, and she is brainwashing him because she's pregnant now and he's trying to please her. He's not anti-Israel, but I see a lot of stuff.
I have the exact same thing. My second child, he is a computer engineer, went to college a Trump supporter, and came out a Democrat with a leftist girlfriend who now he's decided he's not so Jewish anymore. He was bar mitzvahed. He went to a Jewish school from kindergarten through 12th grade. We went to temple every week, conservative temple. I was the president of the temple for a few years. So we were very, very involved in temple life, celebrated all the holidays. And today he's basically not Jewish.
Yep.
Go to college, become less religious.
Should have listened to Prager and not sent them to college.
So it's the theme that keeps popping up here is it reminds me of something that Ben Shapiro says. And Ben Shapiro says that Jews are the most irreligious religious group that there is. And it seems like the disconnection is connected to the lack of religion, the lack of belief in Torah, whatever it is. It's interesting to me that Jews don't even believe their own scriptures, you know? They don't.
Well, we have a rabbi at my temple where I used to go, where I used to belong, that said in front of a class that he does not believe God exists. A rabbi.
Yeah. Then why are you a rabbi? You have no business being a rabbi.
Exactly.
So I do agree that overall it's because people are becoming less religious, but I myself, I'll admit I'm agnostic, but my Zionism is so strong for me, more from a historical connection, right? Like that, we all come from some sort of people. So for me, you know, that's my people, that's my homeland. But yes, absolutely. I think, and this may not be popular to say, but it's worth mentioning. And I think it needs to be mentioned a lot more. There is this very real phenomena among Jews called self-hate. And almost every single Jewish person I know who's anti-Israel got that way because of other Jews. Like my own sister, she went to Duke University. My parents were thrilled. They thought, okay, we're sending her to this conservative, Methodist college. She's going to come out less, Democrat, more conservative. But no, she took a class, and it was innocent. She took a class on the Israeli-Arab conflict in the pure interest of knowing more facts, right? But it was taught by a very leftist, anti-Israel Jewish professor. And that was it. So that clouded her entire thinking, her entire knowledge on history. And I've been a pro-Israel advocate for the past 7 years. And as much as I shove it down her throat with facts, for her, it's, oh, but my Jewish professor in college at Duke taught me this. Like our textbooks were written by Jews. And that,
as I said, the left is a cancer, and unless we eradicate every cell of it, we're doomed. Because they're taking over every aspect of our lives and ruining our kids.
I think it's a little bit more than that, right? Because the left, because we're a minority, such a tiny minority, a lot of the left is non-Jewish, right? The Jews make up 2% of the entire country. I think to turn around, and there's always going to be anti-Semitism, right? Like anti-Semitism existed since the spread of Christianity. It's going to be here for another 1,000 years. It's going to outlive us. What we can do at the very least, and that's what, my business partner and I are trying to do within our organization, is at least share facts to Jews and non-Jews. So the more Jews especially know the facts, right? So, I too believe the lies. I thought that, there would be peace in Israel if only Israel would stop building the quote unquote settlements. I really believe that. That's the question I wanted to ask Natan Sharansky. because I didn't know better. I was ignorant. I was blissfully ignorant, right? And then that information I shared to my non-Jewish friends. If Israel were brought up, I shared it with my Jewish friends, and that's how the lies are multiplied. So it's the least we can do is for at least Jews to know our actual history and not believe our enemies. We're literally trying to take back the narrative.
But it's more than that, because it depends who teaches the actual history. If you learn it from the professor that your sister took, then you won't know the truth. And that's my point. When you have a leftist Jewish professor, or even a non-Jewish professor, brainwashing you, and you look up to them, you come as a freshman to the college, and you're trying to listen to all this stuff, even though for 4 years, forget about 4 years, 18 years, you went to Israel every other year. You saw your grandmother. You saw how Arabs have the same position as Jews. And yet you come into a university and you're done, because the rest of the people, you want to fit, you don't want to be an outsider, and you start believing in it, and the cancer has taken over your brain.
And that's why I really encourage that, so it took me like 7 years. So it actually took me to find a really great partner. That's another reason why only now we're launching this initiative, but we're doing a Zionist education initiative, and we encourage a lot more people to start similar organizations. There's so many Jewish organizations out there, and we feel that they're not connected, right? Like, one says Palestinians, one says, Arabs, one focuses on, just political policies. Another one, just is on college campuses and shouts like, oh, hummus, not Hamas. Like, how is that educating anyone? Like, I went to Columbia for grad school, and they have this infamous apartheid week, which I know they have it on other campuses, but especially in this one. And here you have, the Muslim Student Association, you have Students for Justice of Palestine, with these horrific false pictures of the IDF, slaughtering these Arab kids. The pictures are actually from kids killed in the Syrian war, from Afghanistan. And the Jewish organizations are just sitting there with like a bowl of hummus. How is that teaching anyone? Who cares?
Because the Palestinians have a better PR machine than the Israelis.
Well, it's worse. This has been going on for years. I'll never forget going to Europe with a backpack and a sleeping bag after I graduated from college in Rome. Flyers all over the city with Palestinian liberation and their brainwash. I remember going to see colleges with my son, who's now 37, in the area of Boston and the back east, and every university had a care desk and a Muslim desk. And when I pointed it out to my son, he goes, oh, you're making a big to-do about nothing. I remember going to a wedding at the Beverly Hills Hotel. And when I went to the bathroom, I just so happened to pass by a room full of Arabs fundraising for care. And I said to my husband, this is scary. And my husband goes, oh, you're just hysterical. There's nothing. They have no say. And we just ignored it all these years and did nothing about it. We didn't have the same brainwashing machine. And we don't need to brainwash. We just need to give the truth. Exactly. And we weren't doing that.
Yeah, we need to take back the narrative. Like we need to start speaking out. And so I feel like a lot of Jews who do know the facts, they're not speaking out. They'll read articles, they don't share them. They'll hear things in the news and they won't, write to the news organizations. They'll hear chatter at parties and won't correct it.
Well, because there is a rising growth of anti-Semitism and some people are just afraid.
I understand that. The anti-Semitism is going to get worse if we're going to be silent, right? It's the silence that.
And then where are they going to run to if there's no Israel?
Well, there's always going to be an Israel, right? I mean, the Jews are not going to give up our homeland.
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily. Look at what happened in the election, the last election, who we're in bed with. One of them is Hamas member or Muslim Brotherhood member. And we're talking about giving up land again. We've done it before. And we've lost Israel before. It's not like we haven't lost it before.
And the birth rate of the Arab population is 9-1, where the Jews are basically 2 or 2.4 to 1.
No, that's not accurate.
I thought it's changed.
Yeah, the Israeli Jewish birth rate is pretty high.
Israelis are having babies right and left. I know that my friend's daughter who had leukemia had 4 kids already at an early age. And they're just going to college at the same time while they're working and doing everything. It's not true. We're having more kids. The Arabs who are becoming more prominent and comfortable financially are having less and less. The problem is the leftist brain. Like my friends who are in Tel Aviv, who went to the Tel Aviv University, who think that we should be giving up the West Bank, Judea and Samaria. Don't call it the West Bank.
Exactly. So that's my point, right? Like the more that we can do, like, it's the little things, right? So when someone says West Bank, like correct them, say Judea and Samaria. When someone says Palestinians, if you're not comfortable just saying Arabs, just say Palestinian Arabs. Or I go further and I say, who are you talking about? Are you talking about the mostly Egyptian Gazans? Are you talking about the Israeli Arab Christians? Are you talking about the Israeli Muslim, the Israeli Arab Muslims? Are you talking about?
Oh, my mother-in-law, who was born in Jerusalem before Israel was Israel, and she was on her birth certificate. It says Palestinian.
Exactly. My great uncle was the same thing, and that's what I say. I say, like, are you talking about the Jordanians that were resettled after Jordan occupied Judea and Samaria? Are you talking about the converted Jews who were forcibly converted to Islam? A lot of them, 60% of the South Hebron Hills, the Arabs there, they're Jews. They know they're Jews. And some of them, to show fealty in the past that they were no longer Jews, were forced to commit the most heinous terrorist attacks. Like even today, like some of the most notorious terrorists actually come from Jewish families. Mahmoud Abbas, he comes from he traces his family back to a rabbinic family from 16th century Safed. So there's a real connection. And the more we can point out the truth, or someone, for example, like Barghouti, right? Omar Barghouti, the founder or co-founder of BDS, of the BDS movement, he claims he's a Palestinian. Well, look at his last name. That last name originates in Saudi Arabia, right? So when people say like, oh, I'm Palestinian, we can push back, right? We can say like, oh, well, actually your last name is from Algeria, or your last name is actually from Tunisia, your last name is from Morocco. No,
yes,
you're not.
Yasser Arafat was Egyptian. Yes,
exactly.
But see, Yasser Arafat has a famous speech, we got to find it, where he says, where he's castigating all the Arab countries and saying, we're you, we're Saudi Arabians, we're Egyptian, we're Jordanians, we're Lebanese, we're Syrians. He's actually admitting it.
Absolutely. Yeah. In 1981, the King of Jordan admitted that Jordan is Palestine, Palestine is Jordan. I can go a step further that in 2012, there was, and I can share this after the show, there was a Hamas operative who was pleading with the Egyptians to not cut gas production into Gaza, or I'm sorry, get gas delivery into Gaza. And he said, but most of us are Egyptians. Why is this not being, shared widely? Yes. Why is this just?
Do you think people today really give a shit about facts? If facts mattered, CNN wouldn't be sitting there saying that the Republicans are defunding the police. Facts have no bearing anymore.
Well,
they don't.
So we're not talking about the macro, right? Like we're not trying to change. And I say I said like, Jews like us, like we're not trying to change the massive public opinion. It's never going to happen. But
well, yes, it can. If you put a PR machine like Hamas does, like the Palestinians do, a concerted effort, yes, you can change it. But going out and telling people the facts of it was done in 1948, nobody gives a shit. Sorry.
Well, it depends. Like I've seen opposites, and actually, what's interesting, I've quote unquote converted a lot of people to be pro-Israel through sharing facts, and my success rate has been a lot greater in the Christian community and in the Muslim communities, and it has been with the self-hating Jewish community.
That's a lot.
I applaud you. I applaud you for your minor victories, but there's a whole group of kids going through colleges in the United States by the tens of thousands every year being indoctrinated into anti-American, anti-Israeli, anti-religious values. There's no way to stop it right now unless you stop sending your kids to those type of universities.
Exactly. Yep. And it's true because, I don't know how everyone on this panel thinks, but in a way, Israel should have curtailed the PR machine from our enemies decades ago, and they didn't. And it could have been for a number of reasons. They had other things on hand. They had their own, terrorist fronts to think about.
Nepotism, because they put the people of the relatives or their family, all these politicians, to be the PR who are not capable of doing what they were supposed to do.
Exactly.
Most of it is that situation.
Yeah, I agree. So a lot of it, a lot of times, when I post, I always say Israel's not helping when they say West Bank, when they say settlements, when they say Palestinians. I'm just oh my gosh, here we go again. But nothing we can do, right? So I think that as Jews or allies of Jews, all we can do is do our own part, right? We have the macro issue, but then we have our own individual ways of at least doing something, to correct all of the anti-Semitism that we see in our own way.
Okay,
but I agree.
so
I agree.
I just want to ground the room again. So I identify with every single person so far who's spoken, and I know Barry also. Barry and Mira are new to this format, so you guys don't have to raise your hands. You could just come in, but we do want to also make sure everyone has a chance to speak who wants to speak. I'm hearing that from people who have seen history unfold and have children, this is very terrifying and frustrating. The writing is literally on the wall. I said this in my Facebook Live just last week. 2 school buses were driving around the San Fernando Valley, very Jewish valley, with 2 huge Free Palestine flags on it, with graffiti on the bus that said, anti-Zionism is not anti-Jude, and the Jude was overemphasized large ism, which again, we know the undertones of that. Absolutely, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. And it's what else do we need to wake up? On the other hand, Laureen's perspective is we have no other choice. We have no other choice but to offer information, to lead by example. And it is very scary, and it's going to take a lot for, I hope it's not another second Holocaust, but it's going to take a lot for liberals and liberal Jews to wake up. And I'm glad, though, that you have more success with Christians and Muslims, because we need our allies more than ever. And we don't have the luxury to say, screw the left. We don't have that. We do need them.
And I do say that.
I heard something today that I found pretty interesting, right? And I think it relates to what we're talking about right now. And that there's a group of scientists out there that want a study done about the Wuhan lab, right? And they're asking for it now, and they're saying that they didn't want it before because they didn't want to be associated with Trump, right? So the reason I bring that example up is because I think a lot of liberal Jews, and I'll say that because that's what you put in your in your advertisement for the show tonight. You were talking about liberal Jews. I think if you're so grounded on one side, on the liberal side, to even sound like you're having this opinion makes you look like you're associated with either Trump or associated with the conservatives that you've been so against this entire time. So they're afraid to speak up. I'll give you another example of that.
You can't be wrong. If you made a mistake, you can't change your mind.
Yeah, exactly. And I have a good friend of mine, and I probably mentioned this to you before, Danielle. A good friend of mine, love her. Her name is Deborah. Very Jewish, very liberal, and we used to have conversations years ago about Palestine and Israel back in the early 2000s when Yasser Arafat was around. And she would come to me and she would say, "Joel, am I wrong? Am I wrong for supporting Israel? Is there something that I don't know?" And I told her, I said, "Well, it's hard to negotiate with a side that doesn't even want to acknowledge your right to exist, right?" So we had that conversation. Now, recently, when the whole thing started in Israel over the last month or two, I noticed she's been completely silent on Israel, and I was shocked. So I sent her an email just to ask her, "So where do you stand on Israel?" And she responded, but she didn't give me an answer. And I just feel like she doesn't want to come out and say anything because she doesn't want to be demonized by, a certain side of the aisle. So I think that there's that exists.
Either that or she moved to the other side and thinks Israel's wrong. Do you know Dennis Prager had a debate about who's more hurdle for peace, Hamas or Israel? And guess who debated him? An Israeli professor in England. And they won.
Wow.
He was an Israeli professor who served in the IDF.
Absolutely. Right now we're doing a lot of content research for our website. We're going through academic papers. So many anti-Semitic academic papers are written by liberal Jews. And it's just the way it is. We're not going to change them, but I think there is a sign of hope in that instead of trying to change liberal Jews, some of whom, more than half, are self-hating, it's to move on from them, right? And look at what Trump did with the Abraham Accords, and to give lots of credit to Netanyahu as well. The Abraham Accords would never be, come to fruition had it not been for Netanyahu and his years and years of relationship building with the Gulf states. Who was it? Oh, yeah. Israel now has an embassy in Abu Dhabi. Bahrain just appointed an ambassador to Israel. That's the future, right? So those Arabs, maybe they're not Zionists, they're not going to call themselves Zionists, but they're more pro-Israel than half of our liberal Jews here in America. It's just the way forward. So I think that instead of trying to be so upset with liberal Jews, and obviously we have every right to be, I'm personally upset. I talk about them all the time. I use not so nice words to describe them. I'm not going to do that here. But at the same time, there is a lot of hope for Israel, for pro-Israel mentality among the Arab populations. And I see it. I have an Instagram account. Almost weekly, I get, contacted by Egyptians, by Iranians. Right, like Iranians are very, very pro-Israel. Actually, they when Netanyahu lost, they said, "Oh, we feel like we lost our leader." I follow an account called Zionist Egypt, right? When would that have happened, years ago? We have an Emirati student that just became the first ever, Gulf student at IDC Herzliya. So yes, there's a lot of negative. It's frustrating, but I think not all is lost in the future and strength of Israel and the world stage.
But if you look at the data points, if you track this from the 1940s all the way to today, over that last, 80 years, 75 years, the level of support from Jews, especially, the data points are a downward.
American Jews, yes, because they're first to left, then they're Jewish.
Exactly. And that's
now,
the problem,
what
right?
caused that downward trend? What caused that downward trend partially can be blamed on us parents.
Yep.
On who?
Us parents of children.
Parents. Okay.
But I did everything right. I did everything right. The only thing I did
Mary, I spoke to your kids. I spoke to your kids. They don't think so.
I mean, I think it's something bigger than parents. I mean, so I've studied the history of anti-Semitism. I've looked at 2,000 years of anti-Semitism in Europe and 1,000 years before that, before the Romans conquered Jerusalem, and I consider that to be anti-Semitism also. And so there's this reoccurring trend every generation or so. Wherever Jews are, society seems to rise up against Jews. Anti-Semitism seems to increase, and
Yes.
Jews are persecuted. Their books are burned. They're barred from professions. They're murdered. They're expelled. Whatever it is, beaten. They're forced to wear stars. Whatever it is, and it's a consistent trend that we see over the 2,000 years since the destruction of the Second Temple. Before that, we see 1,000 years of the rest of the world conquering Jerusalem. Jerusalem not conquering anyone else, but we see the Babylonians, the Egyptians, the Persians, the Assyrians, everybody essentially bothered by the fact that Jews are in Jerusalem, praying and lighting candles and singing songs, and somehow that's intolerable to the rest of the world, and that's why they have to invade. And I think we mentioned Rome before in the destruction of the Second Temple. There's this historic monument in Rome, the Arch, which shows the Romans carrying away the Jewish menorah, essentially as a celebration that how we've taken away the Jews' religious artifact, which means nothing to us, but it meant something to the Jews, and we've taken that away from them. So there's this wave of anti-Semitism which continues to rise throughout history. And so I don't necessarily know that if you can put out a PR campaign that is going to do any good, because what we're dealing with is a modern rise of anti-Semitism disguised as criticism of Israel's policies.
Well, what
I
do you
think
do? Okay,
Go
so everything that you described there, that's the history of other people coming against Israel. But what do you do when the people that are against Israel are the very Jews that should be supporting it? And then the other thing I wanted to mention, you talk about there's nothing that you can do as far as a PR campaign. You have to remember that this was something that started a long time ago, right? Because I mean, all of this is connected to this kind of Marxist revolution right now. And they describe it as a long march through the institutions. And ironically, it affects America and it affects Israel. So this isn't just something that happened overnight. This has been happening for years. So you'd have to start with some type of marketing campaign now with the goal that in the next 20 years, you're going to affect some kind of change.
If you
I-
get people
My,
to,
my parents were born in Belarus. I took my mom to see her village, and then we traveled through Belarus with some other group. We took a tour guide, and one of the cities we went to, the tour guide was telling us the history of that city of 600 years. The Jews were brought in. They were very successful. The Jews were very successful. Everybody was jealous that the Jews were so successful. They kicked them out. The city went down in power. They brought the Jews back. The Jews were very successful and they were jealous of the Jews. They kicked them out again. And it happened so many times. And this was a Belarusian that was giving me that history. And I can't remember the name of the town. And that is the crux of the whole thing. Israel is strong. Israel is successful after they tried to kill us. They killed 6 million of us. And look at how we're not sitting there and keeping our people as refugees like the Muslims do. We are a thriving country. We're doing very well. We're successful financially. We made that land of desolated land successful. And that cannot happen because they're jealous of us.
Then why is every generation of Jews become more disconnected from their religion and from their need to be associated with Israel?
Because they became more wealthy, more independent. I mean, I don't even know where to begin. We're talking about a wave of anti-Semitism. What we don't have is a wave of Semitism, and that's what's been lost. And Joel has been the only one to even mention the word Torah. And I may be an idealist, but there's this thing called the covenant that is the basis for the existence of Israel. And you either believe in the covenant because the covenant was promised to Abraham, hence the Abraham Accords. If we reinstituted the Abraham Accords, we'd have peace in the Middle East. So we have a wave of Marxists who have great financial incentives to hold on to their positions and attack everybody. So we're under attack. We're in a war. If I can go back to a little history because it gives me some comfort that if you want to see, if you know where the start of anti-Semitism is, then you know there was a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph. He said there's so many Hebrews that they may attack us or may side with somebody that'll attack us, so we have to do something about them. So you had 400 years of slavery then. You mentioned the Babylonian exile, and I just looked at this recently. The Babylonian Jews gathered together and they worshiped and they studied Torah, and that got them through it. So when the exile happened, what happened? Cyrus comes along and he empowers or conscripts Ezra to go get the 5 books of Moses and teach it to the Jews. So the survival has been there. That's prior to, that was about 300 BC, somewhere around there. So when you get to the destruction of the Second Temple, I keep saying, what happens if we're able to build the temple right there on the mount and have a new temple where that one was? We'd be fighting about whether we have to sacrifice animals in our own temples. So I don't know that we'll ever have the third temple, but over time, from the time of 70 BC, you had the Spanish Inquisition, you had the pogroms in Russia, you had the pogroms throughout Europe. You always had anti-Semitism. A lot of it was based back to Torah. Why were Jews money lenders? Because the Torah says you can't charge interest to your kinsmen. And when the nobles established the church, they couldn't lend money to their kinsmen, so they asked the Jews to lend the money to the kinsmen.
It was called usury. They didn't believe in usury.
Exactly right. And so it was not a violation for the Jews to do it, so the noblemen had the Jews to do it. So you get the bad rap all through history. Then comes the Napoleonic Wars, and Mr. Rothschild in Germany, I think, or in Vienna, sends his 5 sons across Europe to the banks, Bank of England being the biggest one, where all of a sudden they find it very profitable to fund both sides of a war for the last 200 years. So that's going to contribute to an underlying anti-Semitism because of the growth of the central banks. And you can just trace the history. Look at Heschel, and this just blew my mind. Heschel had the first Zionist meetings in 1897. Where? In Basel, Switzerland. What are the current bank regulations worldwide? Basel III. Where did the head of the Rothschild family suddenly, who couldn't afford a doctor, die at age 55 of a heart attack? He was in Switzerland. Where was the Bank of International Settlements? Where was the Balfour Declaration to begin with? You want to trace the history of Israel, it starts with the Balfour Declaration. Balfour telling Rothschild to create a Palestinian state. And the British occupied that Palestinian state through 1945, 1946. And I've just studied this more recently. The Bank of International Settlements, the central bank of all central banks, where was it formed? Basel, Switzerland. What a coincidence. So now the monetary system may be on the verge of change and could change a lot of things. And it's happening out of the Bank of International Settlements, the National Monetary Fund. So it comes back to the Rothschilds they've been done away with. So you have this underlying history of the Jews having to survive, gathering together and surviving because they studied Torah. I got involved with my current relationship with Judaism about 1966 when my rabbi from the Indianapolis Hebrew congregation, who marched with Dr. Martin Luther King, and that may be the start of where all the current rabbis are now a big problem. They have to have a cause, like their Rabbi Maurice Davis. Marched with Dr. King. Lyndon Johnson put him on his Economic Council for Equal Employment. He was a great civil rights rabbi. So now all of them want to be a civil rights rabbi. But there's no civil rights to really give other than defeating what's in Torah and to take popular views. And to be popular and to look to Talmud instead of the Torah for where they teach. So you have all this core of rabbis who you can't even penetrate because they're not even teaching Torah. They're not teaching Jewish values. They're teaching liberal socialist values. And I don't know how you penetrate that. We have a friend, and Muriel will tell you, and Danielle has heard him. He came out of Russia in 1980s, and he'll talk every week. He says there's only one solution for getting rid of the liberals. He says, shoot them all. That's what he's.
Well, it's an interesting point because so you're dealing with an ideology. Yeah. When you think of anti-Semitism, and you think of explaining it to people, you expect them to be rational, but anti-Semitism is not a rational thing. If you look at 1930s in Germany, you had people, modern, educated, cultured Germany. They listened to Bach and Beethoven and Mozart, and they read Kant and Nietzsche, and then they applauded as their Jewish neighbors were hauled off to gas chambers. So what you're dealing with is a change in morality. So in 1947, UN General Assembly Resolution 181 partitioned the territory that was left after the Palestinian state of Jordan was created into a Jewish and an Arab state. And the world's morality was that both these people should have states. Israel declared itself a state, and the next day, after May 14th, 1948, 5 Arab armies invaded. So you have to remember that this modern 70-plus year conflict is anti-Semitism at its root cause, because the Arabs attacked Israel not because it was a state, but because it was a Jewish state. And this is offensive to the Arab world's view that there should not be a Jewish state here. There should only be Muslim states. And through the conflict in the last most of the last 70 years, we saw the Arabs attack Israel again, surprise attack in 73. And the world looked at Jews as being on the right side of morality, not just because they were the weaker party, but also because the world had a certain set of values that, if you blow up a cafe of children or an ice cream shop or a restaurant, or you take Olympic athletes hostages with guns, then you're the bad guy and we're not going to side with you. And that was sort of the world's perspective. And over the last 30 or so years, that changed. So there's this growing ideology, whether it's anti-Semitism, whether it's leftism, whether it's a number of different ideologies which are kind of conglomerating together. You have this growth of these ideologies, and now it's, I think that the change in this last war with Hamas is that so much of the world is seeing Hamas and the Palestinian side as the moral side, even though they're lobbing missiles indiscriminately and Israel is defending itself. So you're seeing a moral shift on a worldwide basis now, the way you saw anti-Semitism rise in individual countries in Europe. So I think to expect it to be rational
It is.
Go ahead.
Oh no, I was going to say, I agree with you. I think there's a systemic brainwashing using terms like human rights, and associating that with Israel violating human rights disproportionately when we see Syria and Lebanon and all these civil wars that are atrocious, with silence being reported from them. And again, vilifying Israel. And we were talking earlier about Jordan. Jordan denied. Where is the outrage towards Jordan not accepting Palestinians into Transjordan? Where's the outrage towards Lebanon? I think if I understand this correctly, right now Palestinians cannot legally be doctors, lawyers, anything professional in countries like Lebanon. Where is the human rights outrage there? And,
well, it's selective.
Yeah,
it's selective.
That's what's so confusing. It's selective. And so why are only the Jews held to this standard that like you just said, we were known for this standard, and now we're being vilified as if we don't have it.
Because we've always been held to a double standard. That's just how it is. Like, unfortunately,
when were we vilified?
Exactly. But to add a little bit to what the architect was saying about Resolution 181, first of all, that was a non-legally binding resolution. And so what actually happened, we had the region of Palestine. And in 1922, after the British had promised that they would work towards sovereignty of all of Palestine for the Jews, right? Because the Arabs didn't even want Palestine. Palestine was always associated with Jews. They wanted Iraq, they wanted Saudi Arabia, they wanted Syria, and they wanted Egypt, for political Arab independence. And in 1922, what happened is that Winston Churchill lopped off 78% of the land, gave it to the Arabs, gave it to a noble family from Saudi Arabia, the Hashemites, to basically thank one of their ancestors, father, grandfather, for helping World War I. They also wanted those countries to push back against Russia. Britain wanted those allies. And what happened in 1947 was not the partition of Jordan. It was the partition of the small piece of land left towards the Jews into yet another state for the Arabs, because the Arabs already have another state. And I think that's so important for us to always share that. There is a second state. The second state is Jordan, right? So like every time that Jews, non-Jews, anyone who's pro-Israel says like two-state solution, that's anti-Semitic. There is a second state. And so I really wish that Israel were pushed back on that. I wish that Israel would apply sovereignty finally to Judea and Samaria. I don't understand why that even was in the clause with the Abraham Accords, that won't happen. But at the same token, going back to what you were saying, Daniela, is that the victim mentality is so ingrained in the left. And what happened is that so many liberal Jews that I speak to, they'll only talk about the Holocaust, right? So it's like, oh, I'm Jewish because of the Holocaust. That was yes, that was a culmination of thousands of years of anti-Semitism, but that was 6 years in our very proud history. So to delineate, the most atrocious genocide in all of history to what we are, right? Like victims of a brutal regime, that does a disservice to us. Like, if you think about who Jews are, we're very proud, we're warrior people, right? Like look at the Judean warriors. We withstood conquer after conquer, as one of the other guests was saying. And so as soon as the liberal Jews see that we're no longer victims, right? Like we were saying, like Israel's a more powerful country. We can hold our own against the enemies. We're making peace with all these Arab countries. That's not in the victimhood playbook, right? And so then a lot of liberal Jews only want to associate with other victims. That's the support with BLM. That's the defund the police movement, right? And so there needs to be somehow, probably not going to happen realistically, but ideally there would be a shift from victimhood and Jews and a victor mentality. Yes. So I think it's the crux of that.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And even the way that Holocaust is being taught in schools in America, it's atrocious, right? Like we're taught, like if someone doesn't know, I have the story that I went to Temple University my first year in Philadelphia. It was a majority Black school and most of my friends were Black. And I was friends with this one girl and she says to me, oh, so is it true that Jews used to have horns? I'm 18 years old. I had experience with anti-Semitism at 14, but nothing major. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. So I sat in her bed and I explained to her why that's not true. She then went into the whole diatribe of like, why did Jews kill Jesus? And next thing I know, I had this whole hallway of people who never met Jews before listening to what I was saying. And then they brought up like the Holocaust, like, oh, blah, blah, blah. So like, we're going from like, us having horns to the Holocaust, right? That's all that a lot of people know. And we need to talk more about the history of the Jewish people. And if we want to teach about the Holocaust, teach it in its rightful context. So that's like, for me, and like, I'm not against teaching the Holocaust, but I'm against how the Holocaust is being taught. And there was this great educator, Ruth Wiss, who's part of the Tikva Fund, and she speaks about it widely, that for us to command better respect, we need to reconfigure how it's being taught. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And not have it be so sensationalized.
Yes, and critical race theory does not help at the moment.
At all. No. And that's the thing. So like, why are these Jewish parents, a lot of them, sitting back and accepting critical race theory? And another thing to note is the more the Jews falsely believe that we're white, like first of all, that's a complete, slap in the face to Mizrahi Jews who are not white, and race is not a skin color. There are Arabs who are light skinned. There are Arabs who have blue eyes. In my own family, I'm obviously light skinned, but my sister is very tan skinned, right? Like my grandfather, like you would think he was an Arab. A lot of Jews have those mixtures in our family. And I think that when Jews realize that we're not white, like we were never accepted by the white community in America until recently, right? Like we had quotas where to live, we had quotas where to work. That's how Hollywood started, right? Like we were not being hired as actors. So we created Hollywood, right? Like we created some of Jewish universities because there were quotas in education. We couldn't live in parts of, Florida, parts of the South, even in the Midwest, there were quotas. So we had our own communities. So
that's interesting because growing up, I always thought I was white. My heritage was Russian, German, Polish. Only recently have I been told I'm not white.
Exactly, right. And that's the thing. So like, right. So a lot of Jews, when they came to America, especially after World War II and the anti-Semitism, Jews wanted to be accepted. And what was the dominant, community? It was white. Like we wanted to be white, right? And also and it's interesting because in Israel, it's 61% Sephardic Jews, right? And in America, it's mostly Ashkenazim. So that's that disconnect too. Like where I grew up in a town that was half Jewish, half not, but all the Jews were Ashkenaz. So I thought all Jews were white. I remember going to Israel for the first time at 13, looking at the advertisements in Tel Aviv. And I asked my parents, I said, why are there so many Black and brown people in the advertisements? I thought that Jews were white. I thought we were in Israel. And they laughed and they said, well, like Jews are very diverse. We come in all colors. I found it fascinating. And I love, like, every time I go to Israel, it's more diverse than being anywhere in New York, right? Like in terms of skin color and all that. But it's going back to our roots, like knowing who we are, right? So when you say like you're Russian, my parents were born in Russia, we have a couple hundred years in Russia, but I'm not Russian. Like I do not personally identify with the Russian culture, with the Russian language, with the Russian Slavic people, because not only were our people treated poorly by their people for hundreds of years, but that's not where our roots are. So like when you have Bernie Sanders going on stage and lying and saying that he's Polish, it completely erases his Jewish roots. So of course,
he doesn't care. He doesn't want to have Jewish roots. Look at Soros. I'd like to answer this question, this point that the gentleman made about how much more and more Jews are drifting away from Judaism. It's always been like that. How many Jews were left in Egypt when we left Egypt as slaves? How many Jews were in Europe not wanting to be Jews, like Soros's parents? There's always something like that. There's always people that want to deny their roots and then walk away from it. I'm meeting people here with a Christian community who tell me, oh, my great-great-grandmother was Jewish, but they decided not to be Jewish because they were done with being persecuted and they wanted to walk away from it. And there are many like that.
Exactly. And how many of us say that our ethnicity is Jewish? I started, the census, the last census, I said other, and then I said my ethnicity is Jewish, right? And the more we say that, like, okay, we're German, we're Polish, we're this, first of all, it feeds into the lie that we're occupiers and from Europe. That's not true. And it completely severs who we are as a people. So a lot of the liberal Jews, they don't understand that. And they'll say like, oh yeah, like my family is German, my family is Austrian, my family is this. No, your family's Jewish, right? Like no one else considered you to be Austrian. No one else considered you to be German, right? Like my parents under communist Russia, on their passport, it did not say Belarusian, it said Jew, right? Like they recognized, of course, it was obviously done in an anti-Semitic fashion, but they recognized that Jews are a separate ethnicity. And I think it's time for us to respect that.
Yeah. I think that's an excellent point, guys, Lorraine.
That when I was growing up,
Mark, hold on for 1 second. I just wanted to emphasize that point for our audience. It's really important to emphasize that Judaism is not just a religion; it is an ethnicity, and it's different than just saying I'm Christian or I'm Muslim. Because if our DNA, no matter where we are on this planet, it does go back to the Middle East. And I think that's a very interesting point that you brought up. It's an ethnic and religious identity, because most people associate Jews as the Ashkenazi Jew. We see the black hats in the media. We see the Seinfelds. We see the Bernie Sanders, the Larry Davids. Everyone's Ashkenazi, yet we are Middle Eastern. We are from South America. We are from everywhere, and it is also an ethnicity. So thank you for bringing that point.
And absolutely,
such a diverse place.
Exactly, and we need to keep emphasizing, like,
incredibly diverse.
61% Sephardic, right? Like, if you follow Hen Mazik, he is first a Mizrahi Jew, and he said that the reason the liberals don't like Israel, one of the many reasons, is because Israel became a true Middle Eastern country, returned to its roots. Because originally, if you think about it, the liberals thought that a mini European country was going to be plopped, like in the middle of the Middle East, right? Like that's, if you think about like actually the racism of the what's it called? the Labor Party, right? Because Likud was the opposite, right? Like Likud was for the Mizrahim, Likud was for the Sephardic. And, you know, you have the Labor Party who said like, oh, you know, like who are these Arab Jews coming in? You know, like they're so dark and this and that. They have different customs. They have different ways of speaking. They don't speak Yiddish. That's not true. I mean, it's part of, you know, our diaspora story, but and like you said, Danielle, like our roots are Middle Eastern, and linking it back to the liberal Jews, right? Because they don't know that we are an ethnicity. To them, we're only a religion. So if you're not religious, and a lot of liberal Jews are not religious. So if you're not religious, then in your mind, you have no connection to Israel, right? Because Israel to them, it's like, oh, the religious aspect of Judaism, I'm not religious, so who cares? But if they can start to think more of an ethnicity, and all ethnicities have homelands, and my homeland is Israel, perhaps eventually that can slowly start to change the mindset.
Laureen,
Yeah.
what does the term religious Jew mean to you?
I don't have an actual explanation. Like for me, like I'm agnostic. I grew up actually atheist because my parents came from communist Russia, so I didn't have any religious exposure growing up. But now that I am a lot more Zionist, I can appreciate Jewish traditions. You know, I sometimes attend Chabad. I went with Chabad to Israel through their JLI program. But the point is that, you know, one can be Jewish and ethnicity and not be religious. And like Danielle was saying, that's not a possibility for any other religion.
I have a similar story to Laureen. I didn't know I was
I'm gonna
Jewish.
say good night. I'm gonna say good night to you guys. I gotta have dinner. I'm falling apart already. It was wonderful to see you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Mary.
Bye.
So I have a similar story to Laureen. I didn't know I was Jewish till I came to America, also from a communist country where there was no religion. And my mother didn't know she was Jewish until she was 16. Her parents didn't tell her in order to protect her in case there was another Holocaust. She could say, I'm not Jewish. What are you talking about? So I think that there's an interesting phenomenon here. When I was growing up, I didn't really want to be Jewish. And I thought it was an extra burden, you know, and I started studying it. And after a while, I thought, what an amazing burden that our job is to be a light unto the nations, you know. And so it kind of grew on me in a way. And I love being Jewish now. I mean, I wear my Star of David proudly, and yeah, I feel that, you know, our morality comes from Judaism. You know, I mean, if you think about what the world was like before Abraham, you know, people were sacrificing their neighbors' kids, you know, burning them in a fire, hoping that there would be a good harvest next year. You know, it was complete chaos. And with Abraham, we stopped sacrificing people. So we got the Ten Commandments, the value of human life, the value of the idea of property, the idea of honoring thy mother and father and family. And so our very moral framework comes from Judaism and our Judeo-Christian values. So when another ideology branches off from that and say, hey, we have a better idea where, you know, the Jews are wrong and we're right, you know, you come up with an interesting question. Does that necessarily mean they are quote unquote evil? And I don't like to use that term, but if they're branching off from the source of our morality, you know, wouldn't they have to be?
Yeah, and actually, I thought you brought up an interesting point that at one point you thought that being Jewish added a burden. I was having a great conversation with Russell Robinson, you know, head of JNF, and he was sharing with me his own story. He said growing up in Texas, being Jewish was not something you'd want to be, right? They had no Jews allowed signs in front of pools, in front of certain establishments. And he was saying that the way Judaism was explained to him, was shown to him, was kind of like having a bad stock, right? Like all he heard about was anti-Semitism, you know, the killings, the persecution. So growing up, he said, like, why would I want to be Jewish? So I think somehow, and I'm not saying to ignore anti-Semitism, it's a huge problem, but I think a lot of Jews focus too much on anti-Semitism, and it kind of pushes away, you know, who wants to hear negative information day in, day out? So I think framing being Jewish is a positive, and like you said that, you know, like light into the world, but why, right? Like explaining, like, you know, what's so special about the Jewish people. Personally, I don't think we're the chosen people. I think, you know, having I think to me, like a lot of, you know, like all people are chosen, right? Like we're all special, we're all here. I don't think the Jews are better than anyone else, but I also think that we're one of the few people who survived close to 4,000 years, right? It's like what, like the Assyrians are still here, the Chinese are still here, and like we're here, right? Like the Romans are not here, the Greeks in that, you know, in their capacity are not here, even the Egyptians, right? The Egyptians of yesteryear are not the Egyptians today. We're here, right? So I think when having children or having those next generations, to explain why we're proud to be Jewish. So maybe that's also going to shift gears a little bit.
Right. It's so easy if you're on the left to, or anybody who is Jewish, who wants to put down Judaism or certain things that Jews or Israel are doing, you get sort of a boost. I don't know if that boost is from anti-Semitism, but it's easy to put your own people down, and people who don't like Jews will certainly, you know, shake your hand that you did that, and, you know, you may win favor with them. But typically that divide between Jews who are faithful and Jews who are not, who sort of branch off into other ideologies, that division is what has, I think, historically been looked at as causing some of the destruction of the temples and so on. That it was something that we brought by being divided. I don't know that you can unite Jews. There's a saying: if you have two Jews, you have three opinions, right?
Or fun.
Right.
Yeah.
So I mean, I think there's so much beauty in the fact that we're supposed to disagree. You know, we're supposed to be the canary in the coal mine, that when evil is rising somewhere in the world, we're the warning sign. The anti-Semitism rises to sort of give us a little nudge, like, hey, there's something we need to do here. We need to figure out this problem, whatever it is, whatever ideology is rising, and that's challenging our moral values, that for some reason now the suicide bombers are the good guys, you know, or the side that's launching missiles indiscriminately are the good guys. Not that I want Palestinians to suffer or anything like that, but there's a problem that needs to be worked out if the world's moral perspective is shifting away from the Jews having the right to be, you know, left alone in peace in Jerusalem, where we've been for 3,000 years and where we are not really, you know, welcomed by the rest of the world. The rest of the world really hasn't been happy with, you know, the Jews being in Jerusalem, not in the 1,000 years BC. And then we were scattered throughout the world. We were persecuted, and we went back to our homeland of Israel, and now nobody's happy anyway. So, yeah, I think this is, you know, our calling to try to understand exactly what's going on. You know, there are moral questions to understand and answer. Why is Israel looked at as racist when they're the indigenous people there, you know, defending their homeland? Why is that apartheid, that the Jews want to preserve their culture? You know, we have 200 plus beautiful nations in this world. Each one has their own unique culture. Each nation has the right to preserve their culture. You know, nobody's saying to, I don't know, the Vatican in Rome, oh, you have to allow in, you know, 100 million Buddhists and take over the Vatican, or if not, you're racist because you're only letting Italian Christians in there. Nobody's saying to the Japanese, oh, you have to allow in, you know, 500 million Muslims, or else you know, you're racist for keeping out these people and wanting to keep Japan Japanese. Nobody's really saying that, because each culture, you know, and we have these values, the rights of indigenous peoples to resist colonization, and they apply everywhere. You know, Mecca and Medina are Islamic. Nobody says that you know, 100 million Christians should be able to march in there, and if not, then they're racist for keeping them out, because we have these values that we value each individual culture. But for some reason, when the Jews want to keep Jerusalem, you know, as the capital of the Jewish state, somehow they're racist, and this is a 3,000-year-old problem, and it defies logic.
It does. And it's funny. Yeah. Israel, and no one can go a day in their life in the West without using some sort of Israel innovation, from cell phones to medical breakthroughs, drip irrigation, yet we have dropped the ball time and time again on good PR campaigning. And it is, you know, from a consumer's perspective, you know, if you don't have good marketing, it doesn't matter how good the product is. The good marketing is just as important as the product. And I think we really failed there. J Street on campus has a fraction of the budget that APAC does and is far more successful in terms of its outreach. And it's because it has an advocacy component that, you know, there's so many Jewish organizations, but they're all 501c3s. So they can educate, but they can't lobby, they can't advocate. And we're seeing the results of that. I mean, the fact that being pro-Israel today to many people means religious and Republican. And we know that, I mean, you're an atheist, you're a not agnostic, Laureen. There's people who can be pro-Israel. There's people who can be pro free thinking and pro-Trump and not be the typical stereotype that has been fed systemically in the mainstream media. And I think that's why it's very confusing. It's very confusing for people to understand how you can be pro-Israel but still have liberal democratic values because of how off we have been with our own branding of this amazing country.
And I think too, like what you were saying, Daniela, is that maybe we need to remind liberals, today's liberals, that their, you know, historical liberal leaders were pro-Israel. Like, you know, President Kennedy was,
yes,
absolutely right. Like, but you know, in terms of like the actual, like, you know, Democrat leaders, you have, you know, President Kennedy was famous Zionist. His brother Bobby Kennedy was murdered by an Arab Christian because Bobby Kennedy supported Israel. He paid for his life for supporting Israel. You have, you know, other, you know, even FDR obviously was anti-Semitic with the immigration policies, but, you know, and Republicans were not always pro-Israel, right? Like, you know, Nixon had mixed policies on Israel. There's this famous book that I'm reading called Harpoon about financial terrorism. And it was written by
Nitzana.
Nitzana Latham. Yeah. So she points out that before 9/11, President Bush was not that, I mean, he was never anti-Israel, but he didn't really want to work with the Israelis. He didn't want to help uncover all the Hezbollah funds. But after 9/11 happened, he understood, right, like what Israel is facing on a daily basis. So that's what I'm saying. It really only started, and even, I don't even think that Clinton was anti-Semitic. I think that he was very ignorant. I think he was very idealistic that, oh, okay, like there are two peoples, so two people should have like each their own land. And I don't blame him. I blame Dennis Ross, who's Jewish, who didn't explain the history to President Clinton at the time. But then it was only with Obama who really made it, you know, like ideologically divisive, right, like on Israel. And so I think hearkening back to the pro-Israel stance that America always had, and it was always bipartisan, right? Like Israel was never an issue. Like even growing up, like, you know, I never remembered Israel being debated on in Congress. It was just like, okay, like America is an ally to Israel, and that's the end of that, right? Yep. There was no Democrats pushing back. So I think it's,
well, the Democrats were pro-Israel 20 or 30 years ago.
Absolutely. So I think if anything, like more constituents need to be lighting the fire under their, you know, like I reach out to my representatives, I reach out to my council members. You know, I basically had a Hamas rally outside, you know, my apartment. I reached out to them and it's like, how could you allow this? Like, did you know about this? Like, who gave them the permits, right? Like, not just to complain about these things, but like actually reach out and have that dialogue. I also think that in terms of Jews, you know, recognize, and I was just thinking about this. There's this famous quote: "If you repeat a lie enough, it becomes a truth." And that's exactly what Arafat did to us, right? Like it was basically a political atrocity. What happened in 1964, right? The PLO was formed with the propaganda wing of the KGB. In 67, you know, the Israelis flew back all those Arab armies, and then Arafat and the PLO realized that we can never beat Israelis militarily, ever. So the only way we can beat them is through political anti-Semitic propaganda, right? And then the Palestinians were born. You know, there were Jordanians who were saying we went to bed as Jordanians, and in 1967 we woke up as Palestinians, right? Like, who's pushing back against this? And so then, you know, enough lie, enough lie, enough lie. And then you have liberal Jews who are saying like, oh, the Palestinians, oh, the Palestinians, oh, the Palestinians.
The Israelis kill Palestinian babies. I can't even tell you how many times I've heard this. People just,
but it's more than that.
To what I said before. They have a good PR machine. We do not.
Right. But even
until such time as we get a good PR machine, hire the guys who are doing Hamas's PR and bring them over, because that's the only way you're going to beat this thing.
Grassroots. And it's going to take like a 20, 30-year plan.
And that's fine. But
that's right.
But even it starts with us, right? Like, even on this panel, like, if you're saying Palestinian, you are basically, I'm not like, you know, blaming anyone, but this is true. Like, you know, Jews who say Palestinian, we're upholding Arafat's lies. We're upholding that propaganda. So we can't expect like some magical propaganda machine to turn back time when many of us, and like, I used that term up until a couple of years ago, I'll admit. And so I'm very vigilant when other Jews especially use that. And I'll say like, oh, so you mean the Arabs, you mean the Palestinian Arabs, right? Like, or do you mean the Gazans? Like, who are you talking about? And I push back, and some of them now are saying like, oh, yeah, like I meant the Gazans. They're like, oh yeah, I mean the Jordanians. So slowly, like that's, I mean, and like I think Mark was saying, it took what, 67, 2021, it took over 50 years for this lie to spread. It's not going to be overnight. But I do think, that with the Abraham Accords, it's going to at least push back the narrative that Jews are some like, or that Israel is some like evil country that can't be worked with, that we're anti-Arab. Like, personally, I'm very pro-Arab. I'm very pro-Arab. You know, I don't mind Arab culture. I have Arab friends. I cannot wait to go to Dubai. I'm going to Dubai in March. You know, if everything works out, I'm going to Oman. I would love to see Bahrain. And so that also needs to be added to the mix. Like, most Jews are not anti-Arab. We're not anti. What we want is for the attacks on Israel to stop, which comes from certain Arabs, not all Arabs, certain Arabs. And that needs to be emphasized. But yeah, I do think that the Arabs. Yeah, but I do think that Abraham Accords are a gift to Israel, and I think a gift to the Jewish people.
They're fantastic, and they give us a new positive direction to go in.
Yeah, and the UAE, the leader of the UAE, came out and condemned Hamas on record. So that gives me hope. You know, let the Arabs school their own about Israel's here, and it's better to make peace. We all benefit. We all have a warm peace. Capitalism always wins. We all benefit when we are all thriving.
Yeah, so, and look what Morocco is doing. Morocco is, you know, making sure that there are less radical imams in Europe, right? Like, you have, and like you were saying, Danielle, you have the UAE that was promoting, you know, produce from Judea and Samaria. Where are you going to find that in Europe, right? Like, now you have the UAE that's more pro-Israel than any country, basically, or almost any country in Europe. I mean, Austria supports Israel now. I know Croatia supports Israel, but, you know, if anyone knows here, Rabbi Eli Abadi, he's the chief rabbi now of the Jewish community in the Emirates. He was saying, you know, he wears a kippah, you know, he's very visibly Jewish, religious Jewish. He says that he feels safer with a kippah in Dubai than he does anywhere in Western Europe. So that's
or maybe or unfortunately even now in New York, because this is where we are.
Yeah, he said that too. Yeah. He said I feel so safe in Dubai. He said people come up to him and say salam alaikum and want pictures with him and congratulate him for living, you know, in Dubai. It's So
this is the news stories that we should be seeing. This is the news story we should be seeing.
And then I think the liberal
on that note, I have to exit.
We're gonna wrap up. Do you have some takeaways, Joel, before you go? We're wrapping up now.
No, I think that I don't know your name. You had got a lot of good points there, and I think one of the things that I'll take away with me is the fact that you know, Palestinian has always been kind of a vague term, because what exactly does that mean? But I think I think that was a good point that you were making about well, who exactly are we talking about? Are we talking about Jordanians? Are we talking about Gazans? Because there's different groups of people there Also, the fact that in 1948, Jews were considered Palestinians. Also, that's something that people don't know. That on what's her name? What's her name? Mary. Did she say that? Yeah, didn't she say that on her mother's birth certificate it said Palestinian?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
So yeah, very
And
interesting.
my great uncle also, he was a Palestinian Jew.
Well, let's also, before you go, let's define Palestinian. It's not an Arab word. Can we say how that word
in fact,
came to exist?
There's no P in Arabic. There's an
no
F sound, but there's no P sound in Arabic.
Yeah.
It's actually a Greek word, right? And then the Romans just renamed Israel to Syria, Palestina.
So the Philistines were invaders from Greek islands who came up on the shore there, and actually Plishtin is what the Jews called them, which is the word for invaders. And then so that name kind of stuck, so they were called the Plishtin. And then when Rome conquered Jerusalem, they didn't want the Jews coming back there, so they called it Syria Palestina. They picked actually two of the Jews' enemies and named the place, which doesn't make any sense, because why would a place be called two of a country's enemies unless it was done deliberately to keep the Jews from having Jerusalem, which is kind of like a bug that the world seems to have.
Exactly. But actually, so fun fact, the Romans were actually not anti-Semitic. And I think this is a point of pride for Jews, the reason why we were punished the most, the Jewish people, is because no other group fought the Romans as hard as the Jews did. You know, it took 3 very expensive wars. It cost them more men, more money to subjugate than any other group. And so it wasn't they didn't hate Jews because we were Jews. They hated Jews because our people fought back the hardest and was in their way the most. So to me, that's kind of a point of pride as well.
Yes. Yes. Thank you, Joel. Thank you so much for your input and your questions and your curiosity, because it really helps us further changing the narrative, like Laureen was saying. And it's people like you who give us hope. You know, you see things for what they are. You don't have any qualms the way a lot of liberal Jews do about posting what you've learned and correcting misinformation. And we're very, very grateful to you and people like you.
Thank you so much for having me. This is a pleasure. Thank you.
All right. All right. Well, I will see you guys.
Yes. Till the next time.
Good night.
Okay. Anyone else would like to go and share and some takeaways? Lee, yes, you've been listening and quiet.
No, sometimes you learn more by listening than by speaking. It was a very robust conversation tonight. And there was really no airtime there. So I figured, you know what, let me just listen. One thing I want to make to Laureen with her friend, who you can be pro-Palestinian if you're using that term and still be against Hamas. It's not mutually exclusive. You can be supportive of people and whatever injustices you may think are that are real without supporting a terrorist organization. I don't know if your friend realizes that just because someone has a P in front of their name doesn't mean she needs to support them.
Well, ex-friend now, but yeah, so to her, it was a green light that because Israel is so quote unquote evil, that she has this obligation to support terrorist organizations. That's the danger part of it. But yeah, I mean, like, you know, when people say like, oh, you know, free Palestine, and a lot of people, you know, who are pro-Israel, we say, well, free Gaza from Hamas. That should be the slogan.
100%.
Right?
That'd be a great slogan.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. Great point. All right, Mark, Barry, architect. Takeaways, final thoughts?
Okay, final thoughts, because I do have to go also. We have a growing problem. It goes through waves, anti-Semitism. You can call it anti-Zionism. You can call it anti-Semitism. It is one and the same. You can't hide one without the other. They are intertwined and forever intertwined. We need, like I said earlier, not only a good PR campaign, we also need to take our children and almost indoctrinate them in religious schools. I have a 9-year-old, okay, who goes to a Chabad school. My other 2 children went to TVT in Orange County. My 2 stepkids went to Chabad in Huntington Beach. They've all done pretty well. They're all very pro-Israel. some more Jewish than the other, but all pro-Israel. We need to indoctrinate our kids, much like the Arabs indoctrinate their kids. If we don't do that, then all will be lost, because the farther we go generations down the line, they become less Jewish and unfortunately less Zionist.
It's a problem. It's a problem, but Nami's going to make it through, Mark. She's not going to go to college. She's going to make it through.
All my kids are pro-Israel.
Yeah.
Not necessarily.
Even the liberals. That's great.
Even my liberal son is pro-Israel.
And let's not give up on liberals. So my sister, as much as I disagree with her Israel stance, but just the other week, she said that, oh, Jews are not white. I'm like, oh, okay. So you're listening, you're absorbing information. You know, it's a slow crawl for many. Many are never going to be pro-Israel, but I don't think we should ever give up.
Yes.
Israel is so liberal.
I'll make a couple final points. There are really two groups, anti-Semitic and Semitic, in this world. The Iranians are a good example. The Iranians are pro-Israel that I think you've encountered, because they know that Israel is their strongest ally against the Ayatollah government. They don't want the Ayatollah government. They want freedom. People who want freedom want Israel. Same thing is true here. In Washington, the ones that are anti-Semitic are more pro-power for themselves, and they're looking for a voter base for what they think will sell and what will keep them in office and will get them donations. I think it has nothing to do with ideology. That's why I commend you for trying to argue with a liberal. But as I tell a friend of mine, why can't you argue with a liberal? I said, because they're Canaanites. You just go in and make sure you can live with them or get rid of them, but you're not going to change their minds. They believe in idols, and the idols they believe in is themselves. And that's the breakdown. The final thing is that the reason I think you're having better luck with Christians, the Christians, while looking at Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, everything ties back to the first 5 books, to the Old Testament. And they follow the Old Testament. Our founding fathers believed in the Torah. They built our Constitution, our laws on the Torah. And our whole country was built on the Torah. And they likened the pilgrims to the Jews leaving Egypt. And they knew that the sons of Abraham were the founding basis for this country. And that you mentioned 1948, it was Harry Truman, after Roosevelt was dead, who had to follow God's will with using the atom bomb invented by Einstein and with creating Israel, to the point that he said, I am Cyrus. And he had been sort of anti-Semitic all his life, but his Jewish friends made him realize that this was important. So those are my final thoughts for tonight.
Thank you, Barry. Thank you for coming on the call.
Oh, my pleasure.
Okay, Mr. Architect.
So I think we try to be rational people, and we try to be rational human beings, and we think of ourselves as rational, but we're really a lot more primitive and primal than we think. We think that we make our decisions logically, and we really don't. We make our decisions emotionally based on primal fears and urges, and then we later rationalize them. And I think anti-Semitism is the same way. I think it's a primal instinct to hate Jews for whatever subconscious reasons. And I think later on, people rationalize it. That's why for 2,000 years in Europe, there was a different excuse every time. Jews were causing diseases. They were, poisoning wells. They were eating, matzah with baby's blood, like, really, but yeah, and then so it's almost like, as human beings, the more intellectual we become, the better we become at rationalizing our primitive, primal, savage instincts. That's why you see, modern educated culture, Germany was the most effective and efficient at, sending Jews to the gas chambers, and it made perfect sense to them somehow. So I think that, we need to take that rationality and, you know, we need to take a step back and say, okay, well, what if this is a primal hatred? What if, you know, thinking that Israel is the only country that doesn't have a right to exist? You know, the Italians can have Italy, and the, you know, Japanese can have Japan, but the Jews shouldn't have Israel. Maybe I should take a step back and, you know, look in the mirror and look for anti-Semitism there. I think that would be a, you know, a great way for humanity to start. Unfortunately, that's a, you know, rational argument, and I don't know if that's where we're headed. So Carl Jung said that until you make the subconscious conscious, it'll forever control your life, and you will call it fate. So I think if we can try to dig deep and really not just do a PR campaign, but understand those deep primal primitive urges of why do we hate Jews? What is it about, you know, the Jewish family, the Jewish faith, whatever it is that's beneath the surface? That's not, you know, the excuses that we rationalize. You know, the United Nations can pass resolutions all day against Israel and none against the whole rest of the world, and it makes perfect rational sense to them. I think, you know, if we try to take a step back and really understand anti-Semitism better, I think that's the way that we're going to help humanity try to understand ourselves better and evolve, hopefully, to a people who no longer need to, you know, have the scapegoat. Maybe.
Yes, we can't ignore what's happening. Lorraine, do you have some final points to close on?
So my final takeaway is just to reiterate our proud Jewish history, reiterate that we're from the land, we're of the land, we're indigenous to the land, and to share those facts and not to really focus on those who push away from that and who hold on to the lies and look to the future. And like I keep saying, like the Abraham Accords. So if the Gulf Arabs are going to be more pro-Israel than half of our people in America, so be it. You know, maybe eventually they'll come around, but it just knowing the reality of where we are, why things are the way they are, and it's very much tied to politics in this country, and just to move forward.
Yes. Beautiful. I mean, I'm going to reiterate my takeaways from you as well. 2 points that we can all utilize better in everyday conversation is that Jewish people are not just a religion, it is an ethnicity. It does go back to the Middle East. And I loved what you just said again, Lorraine. Stop wasting time on people who are, you know, prefer to be, you know, closed-minded and rigid. We don't necessarily need them. We do have the Abraham Accords. We do have so many allies who are aligned with our values and what Israel stands for. And to be open that other people will come our way too, but to be mindful of where we put our energy and to let go of what is not working and to put our energy where it can be. And we do need to all have our eyes opened. So thank you so much, everyone who's joined us live on the call and online. It really does start with a conversation. The very fact that you're here, even if we can agree to disagree, at least you have another perspective. You're more informed. And if you too would like to be on philipbloom.com/America's Voices, and we'd love to have you as well. In the meantime, God bless each and every one of you. And of course, God bless America.
You too, Danielle.
Thank you very much.
Bye, guys.